Thank you for listening to this podcast from TRE, Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain and around the world. For more information, please visit tre.radio.
You're listening to Hannah Murray on The Book Show.
Joining us on the line now is Ed Needham. He's the editor and publisher of Strong Words magazine. He joins us once a month on The Book Show with some new reviews on some non-fiction books and fiction books. How are you, Ed?
I'm very well, thanks. Lovely to be here.
Oh, great to have you with us. So let's start with non-fiction, and we have London Falling.
Yes, this is a book that is generating a tremendous amount of attention at the moment. You probably heard about it in all sorts of places, but I really can't speak highly enough of this book. This is one of those rare books that oblige you to completely rearrange your schedule so that you can carry on reading it. You know, it just refuses to let you leave. So the author, Patrick Radden Keefe, he's a writer for The New Yorker. You might know him from another absolute schedule buster. He wrote a book called Empire of Pain a few years ago about the Sackler family and their part in the opioid addiction crisis around the world, but particularly in the United States. And he was in London a couple of years ago, perhaps it was 2023, and through a coincidence, he was working on a film at the time, through a coincidence, he was introduced to a family who in 2019 lost their 19-year-old son in a mysterious accident. And this family feels that the police never really made much effort to sort of investigate what happened, find out what was behind this incident. So the young man who died was called Zach Bretler, and he fell from the balcony of the 5th floor of a luxury apartment block by the Thames in the middle of the night. And this apartment block is directly opposite the headquarters of MI6 on the other side of the river, on the South Bank. And MI6 is naturally just covered in security cameras. And they recorded CCTV of this young man at 2:00 in the morning, walking on this balcony, walking out of the apartment onto the balcony, going from one side to the other, and then jumping. So this is an attempt by the author to piece together what happened. Why was he there? Why did he jump? Who else was there? What was the background to this story? And it is just one of the most compelling stories you'll ever read. So I don't want to spoil the surprises. This is a book that is just full of astonishing revelations and cliffhangers. But just as a bit of background, this boy Zach grew up with his parents and brother in North London, fairly affluent family. He went to a private school. But as he got towards the end of his school years, he appeared to be less interested in education and more interested in kind of making money and the trappings of affluence. You know, he was really into watches and fancy cars and the sort of status symbol obsessed version of being a man. So he left school, fell out with his parents a bit, as many teenagers do, became a bit difficult. But he seemed to have access to an awful lot of money, a lot more money than most teenagers do. And at one point, he shows his father his bank statement that appears to have £850,000 in it. Right? So he's, I think, you know, by this stage, 17, 18, something like that. And he's so, you know, where has it come from? Some sort of wheeler dealing? It's just not clear. So he moves out, or at least he comes and goes from the family house, and he spends some of his time at this apartment, this riverside apartment from which he jumps in November 2019. So when the author starts looking into this story that already seems to require a degree of explanation, you know, there's a lot of questions need answering here. He finds out that a lot of people had been under the impression that this young man was not the son of a fairly normal North London family, but that he had convinced them he was the son of a billionaire Russian oligarch. All right. So he was living this slightly fantasy existence, but just think how difficult that might be to pull off. You know, where would you even begin and why would you want to do it? So as the author pulls on these strings, he unearths some very chilling stories of the kind of people that Zach was spending time with, people who were interested, you know, the son of a billionaire oligarch for not entirely positive reasons. And it comes together in absolutely riveting fashion. You know, every chapter seems to come with a mind-blowing twist. And it also leaves you with a couple of rather disturbing questions. One, for parents at least, how well do you know your children? And the other, for everyone, is do you have any idea how close the criminal world is to your daily activities and your idea of security? So that's London Falling, and it's by Patrick Radden Keefe. I really recommend it highly.
Gosh, it sounds great. Sounds like a great novel, but it's actually true.
It could be, it's absolutely gripping. It feels so improbable at times that, somebody must have made it up. The characters are extraordinary, frightening. The cliffhangers are, like I said, you would cancel really important meetings to carry on reading this.
Wow. Could be a good TV series as well.
I expect it will be, yes.
Okay, and then we have A Murder in Paris.
Okay, A Murder in Paris. This is by an English writer who lives in France called Edward Chisholm, and it's another very stylishly produced crime story. So the murder in the title is a famous one and an unsolved one. And this is a book that is more interested in investigating a sort of particular moment in French history and the challenges of finding out what happened or might have happened than in revealing the murderer. But it's no less intriguing for it. He certainly tries very hard to put a name to who might have done this. So the book starts with the discovery of a body in a bag one morning in October 1968 on some waste ground beside a road on the outskirts of Paris. And after a while, they identify the body as a man called Stephen Markovic. He's a Yugoslavian. And this Stephen Markovic had been a bodyguard and gopher in the entourage of the movie star Alain Delon. And so a large part of this book looks at just how significant a figure Delon was in France at this time. A massive star. It's hard to imagine a star being able to become any bigger. And this is at a time when French cinema was absolutely at its peak and when France had never been more chic, more enviable. It was an absolute byword for glamour. And these people, Delon and his people, they were always whizzing off to Saint-Tropez in their open-top sports cars and, taking speedboats to Monaco and smoking their gitane at Le Discothèque and absolutely living the glamorous life. So Delon was himself box office gold. He was trying to make it in Hollywood at the time. The press was obsessed with him. And he was a tremendously charismatic character in himself, right at the middle of this absolute, tornado of glamour. And he often played tough guys in his films or killers, and he enjoyed the public's association of him with this type of person. He very much played up to this side of him, that he was a bit dodgy. And he enjoyed the company of that type of person, underworld figures. So another part of the book describes the extraordinary relationship of the French underworld, especially the Corsican underworld, with the politicians of the day. It was only 20 years or so after the end of the war, after all. So and during the war, very strong relationships were established in the French resistance between criminal families and men who went on to become very powerful politicians in France. And General de Gaulle rewarded certain Corsican families, for their help in the resistance with control of certain ports on the Mediterranean and casino licenses, which meant that politics and crime were very tightly interwoven. So this is also a world in which Delon moved. And it being France, everyone was having sex with everyone else at the slightest opportunity. So when the police came to investigate the death of this character, Markovic, they found that as an aide-de-camp to Delon, someone very much in Delon's inner circle, he was also moving among these criminal circles, political circles, and that one of his tasks was to take photos of everything that went on. And these photos were often quite compromising, both of Delon and of senior politicians and criminals, all, together and often in flagrante. And so the more the investigation went on, the more it seemed to lead right to the top of the government, not quite as far as de Gaulle, who was above such decadence and, probably the straightest politician of all time, but very close to the top. And it became so embarrassing at a time when France was teetering with, student protests and unrests and riots in the street and so on in 1968, that the investigation was buried. The investigation into this murder was just covered up. It seemed to lead to too much compromising material. And the documents were sent to the archives, and the whole thing was kind of forgotten about. So another part of the book is about the challenges of extracting this material from these archives. Even now, it's not easy. There is for some reason, there is an unwillingness to look at this incident. And so it leaves one with a very beguiling and not unattractive representation of this very glamorous, very cool, but very compromised view of the French elite and their criminal associates with a very sort of gilded movie star at the center of it all. So as a sort of, trip back into 1960s France at its absolutely most dazzling, but also perhaps its darkest, it's very interesting, fascinating account. So that's called A Murder in Paris, and it's by Edward Chisholm.
Sounds great. And then moving on to fiction, we have The Keeper.
Yes, The Keeper is by Tana French. A lot of people will know Tana French already. She's a very successful crime writer. She's written some terrific, very atmospheric and very unhurried crime novels. She is a writer who likes to take her time and build the atmosphere. She likes to build a sense of uncertainty and unease and suspicion. This is absolutely not wham, bam, let's have a car chase kind of crime writing. And it's all the better for it. So Tana French is American. She's been resident in Ireland for a long time. And this book, The Keeper, is the third book in a trilogy about an American in Ireland. You don't need to have read the other two to enjoy this one, but her main character is a former Chicago detective called Cal Hooper, and he has come to this village called Ardnakelty, a tiny little speck in the west of Ireland, to kind of decompress, to get away from his Chicago cop life. And he's ended up staying. He's been there for a few years now. I think maybe 2 or 3, something like that. He has a relationship with a local woman, and he's also sort of semi-fostered a local teenage girl who was living a kind of feral life. And so he has roots in the community, and he feels himself part of the town. And in the first couple of scenes in the book, you think, well, he's right to feel himself part of the town, because you see him in the shop talking to the shopkeeper about setting a date for his wedding, and then he's in the pub sort of bantering with the local men. It's all very slow build. You think, where's the crime here? He's just chatting to people. But the dialogue is exceptional, and it's an entertainment in itself just to watch these characters pass the time, because they're so sharp-tongued and gossipy and engaging, and kind of without realizing it, you're actually being shown a great deal about this community and how it fits together and what the sort of hierarchy is. And you also get a sense that this is a community that runs on its own rules. The police are a long way away, and the power here is something that goes back generations. In this sense, it's less like Ireland and perhaps more like Sicily. Everybody knows who the important families are. Everyone knows who gets to say what can and can't happen, and woe betide anyone who disagrees. So eventually a local girl disappears, and she is found dead in a river, and everyone is happy to go with a verdict of suicide for this strange, unexplained death. The autopsy said she drank some antifreeze. So that means, if it's suicide, there'll not need to be any more questions asked. Life can go on. We can all forget about it. But our detective, Cal Hooper, he suddenly finds himself torn. If he wants to feel he fits in as part of the community, then that means not sticking his nose in or asking any awkward questions. But if he wants to be true to his values, he's a man of justice, then he is going to have to go against the majority way of doing things and take on some people who are very skilled in making life uncomfortable for others. And not necessarily by violence, but they just know exactly what strings to pull to make people feel insecure in their own houses. He can get people's cars taken away from them, or get people investigated by the tax authorities, this kind of thing, this kind of making people feel insecure. So obviously behind this girl's death, there is a story, and it's a story that connects to what the local big man does or doesn't want to happen. And Cal is going to have to tread very, very carefully if he doesn't want to alienate all his friends and neighbours in this tiny village by asking uncomfortable questions. Mm-hmm. So that's The Keeper, and it's by Tana French.
Great. And finally, No Such Thing as Monday.
Yes, there's no such day as Monday. It's by Sian Hughes. This is a writer I'd not heard of before, and I suspect most people won't have either. But I think this book deserves a lot of attention, and it's about growing up in a house where people have next to nothing, and a situation which just prepares them for a life of having next to nothing, and how it's a very difficult cycle to escape. But it's also about how growing up in such an environment, it's not just a question of not having things, but about how people are conditioned to behave in ways that mean things never get any better. So it sounds a bit grim, and it is, but it's written in such a compelling and authentic tone that you are completely engrossed and completely on the side of the woman who's telling the story. So she starts telling it as an adult when she leaves her work in a dry cleaners one lunchtime to take her father his lunch, and she lets herself into his flat and she finds him dead, with his savage dog tied to his chair, barking away. So this is the way she gets into telling the story of her family and what it was like as a child. And her father was a sort of no good individual. He's lazy and violent, and he trained dogs to fight. And one of his techniques to train them was to put them in cages next to each other and give one dog food and the other nothing. And this apparently would enrage the dog that didn't have anything. And that anger would channel into its fighting ability and give it something called gameness, which is an ability to keep fighting even when you're completely out of energy. When you've got nothing left, you can still keep going. So this dreadful father has two daughters, one of whom is telling the story, and he brought them up in a similar way to his dogs. One daughter had stuff, the other had nothing. So, for example, he divided their bedroom down the middle, and one had a light, the other didn't. One had a window, the other didn't. One was locked in, the other wasn't. And at some point during their secondary education, sort of mid-teens, this other daughter, the narrator's sister, just disappeared, never to be seen again. No explanation from family, no explanation from neighbours. So our narrator, who definitely has game, she has been down to zero on many occasions, and the book describes many of these predicaments. She always finds the motivation to fight on, and her goal is to one day find out just what happened to her sister. So this means going back and trying to shake some information loose from this awful neighbourhood where she grew up, while at the same time kind of keep body and soul together when the conditions she has to live in seem to be conspiring against her. So this is absolutely not a story of someone feeling sorry for themselves, but I really liked it because it's so brilliantly written in this tone of this determined woman. It's such a rare environment to visit, and this is not slum tourism. It's not sentimental. It feels a very authentic picture of poverty. And it's great because you just so badly want something good to happen to her. Mm-hmm. So that is, let me remind you of what it's called again. There's No Such Day as Monday, and it's by Sian Hughes.
Wow, that sounds great. It's amazing how people come up with these ideas, isn't it?
Well, I think there might be a little bit of, personal experience in there, but it's the magic of it is in capturing this tone. It's that sometimes, you really feel books are speaking to you in a voice that is impossible to ignore.
Yeah. Great. Well, some lovely recommendations there. Thank you to Ed Needham, editor and publisher of Strong Words magazine. If people want to subscribe to the magazine, they can do so online, can't they?
Yes, they can. And I really urge everybody to. You can subscribe to the magazine, which comes out 8 times a year and recommends lots of new books in a most entertaining way. And you can also subscribe for free to the weekly newsletter, which is lots of great new books in an entertaining way too. So you can find all that at the website, which is strong-words.co.uk.
Perfect. strong-words.co.uk. Ed Needham, thank you very much for being with us.
You're so welcome.
The Book Show with Hannah Murray.
Joining us on the line now is Alan Saxton, who since retiring as a general surgeon has had time to pursue 2 of his passions, creative writing and medical education. He currently teaches at 2 medical schools. He's with us on the Book Show to talk about his new novel, Training in Charity. Told with humour and empathy, it captures what it meant to begin a life in medicine before computers and technology softened the edges. A time when skill was learned by doing, compassion was earned at the bedside, and the making of a doctor was as raw and real as the city that held him. Welcome to the Book Show, Alan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. And what a great idea for a story, for a novel. Why did you choose to make it a novel as opposed to a memoir?
I thought that the story would read better as a novel. And if it were a memoir, I don't think it would be as interesting to the public. A lot of the cases that I refer to actually happened, but not necessarily in the early stages of my training. And I wanted the book to appeal to people more in that in the United States and in Europe, the general public seems to be drawn to character-driven medical stories. The medical setting lends itself to a dramatic context. And I thought by fictionalizing my characters, I would draw people in that way and make it more appealing to non-medical people.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a fascination, don't we, with medical dramas and things.
Well, I've watched episodes of Casualty, which is it's been a long-running show in England, and has developed that kind of popular audience. Currently in the United States, a lot of people, and I might add, maybe for the first time, medical people have been entranced by watching a show entitled The Pit.
Yes, it's supposed to be very realistic.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, unlike some of the others, perhaps. So I mentioned in the introduction the idea of beginning a life training in medicine before computers and technology. How much different is it now, do you think, then?
Well, a lot of the students that I work with now are exposed to simulated situations using mannequins and computers, or actors or actresses who are hired to act as patients. And in training back in the 1970s, where my book is set, we learned on real people. There are probably pros and cons to both approaches. For example, if you want to teach a medical student how to create an emergency airway, like a tracheostomy on a patient, the training's probably much better done on a mannequin rather than on a patient who actively can't breathe.
Yeah.
But by the same token, part of the art of medicine is being able to talk to people, demonstrate empathy, and obtain a history that allows you to construct a narrative of their illness. And that's pretty hard to do from a mannequin.
Yeah. No, it makes sense that there are pros and cons with it. So your main character then, Adam Sinclair, is he sort of based on you or not really?
Well, he certainly is. I think I read somewhere something to the effect that all fiction is memory, or maybe it was all memory is fiction. But I think most writers draw on their own personal experience when they're trying to create a setting and characters for a story.
Yeah. So tell us about the settings of New Orleans. Does that come into it? What's the relevance of that?
Well, I attended Tulane University Medical School in New Orleans, and New Orleans is a very unique city. Many people consider it the most European city in America. So it has its own culture, cuisine, and it was home to Charity Hospital, which closed after Hurricane Katrina. But Charity was the second oldest public hospital in the United States. It was founded a month after Bellevue in New York, which was in 1736. And it provided training ground for generations of physicians. There is a legacy of these kind of public institutions in America that have really been beneficial, not only to providing care for the uninsured or the indigent, but in providing hands-on training to medical personnel. And in looking at the comparison of the European training programs, I think all of the programs, regardless of which side of the pond you're on, deal with a gradual acquisition of skills. And I noted that in Spain, a lot of the training is still done through public hospitals.
Wow, interesting how it's so different in each country.
Yeah, it is, but I think that the progression is still sort of judged the same.
Right.
If you're training somebody, you want them to acquire the necessary skills. This may sound rather silly, but you want them to be competent that you can release them on the public.
Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. And how did you keep a notebook or anything when you were working to remember a lot of the things that happened that you ended up putting in the book, or is it all just in your head?
Well, I wish I had kept a notebook, because the things that I wrote about and drew on were really all memories. And I'm sure there are some things that I would like to have been able to go back and review. But I was intrigued to write the book in part because I carried these stories around for upwards of 45, 50 years.
Amazing. So without giving too much away, can you tell us a bit about what happens in the book and what Adam goes through?
Well, the story is centered on Adam and two of his fellow students who are beginning their third year of medical school. In the U.S., the first 2 years of medical school were mostly lectures, maybe going into laboratories, and towards the end of the second year, there's an exposure to learning how to do a physical exam. But the beginning of the third year, students in actual patient care rotations, along with residents who are tiered in the sense of their positions in the program, what's expected of them, and the type of graded responsibility that they have. And my experience was that going from the academic environment into the practice of medicine and dealing with real patients was a transformative experience. And I hope that that's communicated to my readers when they go through training in charity. Again, there's a lot of medicine in it, but that's really, and a lot of surgery, but that's the scenery. The real story is the development of these characters.
Yeah. And being a surgeon, a lot of people can't even imagine what that must be like, being a surgeon and having that much responsibility. Can you tell us?
Well, my uncle was a doctor, was a physician for, I think, about 50 years. And he once said to me that once you really get started, you'll find out why they call it going into practice, because you're always learning. And that's been my experience. You really have to keep an open mind, be open to learning new skills and understanding changing concepts. And at the same token, even a surgeon who has to be somewhat emotionally removed and objective needs to be able to demonstrate to patients their caring and their concern. My uncle also used to say, when I went out and started my practice, my neighbors became my patients and my patients became my friends.
That's nice. That's nice. Yeah, I mean, you must be used to seeing the same people time after time and get to know them and their families really well.
Well, in the practice that I was in, about 30% of our practice was breast surgery and breast cancer. And one of the biggest thrills that I had in retirement was shortly after I retired from my practice, I went to a grocery store and I was in the produce department. And I bumped into a woman who I had operated on for breast cancer more than 25 years before.
Oh, amazing.
And we stood there among the heads of lettuce and the carrots and talked for 45 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. I bet she might have been a bit emotional.
Well, I can't speak for her, but I know it, in retrospect, it had that response for me.
Yeah, I bet. So having created this book, do you think there's more stories about Adam Sinclair? Could there be a sequel?
I don't think so. I worked for about 10 years on this book. Okay. And as I've done that, I realized that being a writer also is a gradual accumulation of skills. So I'm part of a writing group, and I've taken courses in creative writing. And I find that my imagination is attracted to other plot lines. I do have another book out, which is a novella that is a love story set against the Allied assault on Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. And one of the characters is a British nursing student. And researching that book and learning about the history of nursing in Britain gave me a completely different impression of how the profession of nursing really has developed, which is also carried over into the role of nurses in the United States.
Interesting. And one more thing I wanted to ask you about the layout of the book. You've got lots of short and numerous chapters, 99. Why did you do that?
That's correct. Some of them are only a page, but I find for my own personal enjoyment of reading, I like books that have chapters that are short, so I don't feel I'm getting bogged down. And when I finish a short chapter, I want to keep reading. Two of my favorite writers are Larry McMurtry and Dan Brown, and they construct a lot of their work in those little vignettes that just move the story along and make it more interesting for readers. And fortunately, several of the people who have read Training in Charity have implied to me that I have accomplished that somewhat.
Yeah, great. Well, if people want to get a copy of Training in Charity, it's out now. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Alan Saxton, who we've been chatting with. Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're listening to The Book Show with Hannah Murray on TRE.
Joining us on the line now is Patrick Hardy. He's qualified as a lawyer in England, Hong Kong and Guernsey. He also holds a personal trainer certification. He's with us on the Book Show to talk about his debut novel, A Death in the Gym. It's a gripping murder mystery that sees a personal trainer and part-time investigator wrapped up in a case which stirs up old memories. Welcome to the Book Show, Patrick.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi. So what made you want to write this book?
I'd always had this ambition to write a book. I'd written short stories when I was younger, and then I started a job and then felt I never had really time to continue writing. But it was always sort of on my bucket list as one of the things I wanted to do. I think a lot of people say, oh, I've got a book inside me, and I was sort of one of them. But it's something else to actually try and write one. And I wanted to write something which I would enjoy reading. So for me, the idea was to write what's hopefully a sort of mystery thriller, page-turner novel, one that once you start, you want to just keep reading. So that was the ambition, and hopefully that's what I achieved.
Yeah, and how did you find the writing process?
Well, I found it quite difficult because everything's sort of new. You're kind of figuring it all out as you go along. One of the first questions I really had was, this kind of book where you're essentially sort of revealing clues early on for things which might come later. I mean, how do you actually do that? Do you plot it all out in advance? Do you have a very detailed story before you begin writing, or do you sort of make it up as you go along? I ended up doing the second. I really did make it up as I went along. I wrote the first page with the most general idea of a story, no real sense of any of the plotting, and thought, well, if I don't know what's going to happen, nor will the reader. But unfortunately, it's a very inefficient way to write, because you get to sort of page 50, and then a good idea comes to you, and you've got to rewrite the first 10 pages to signal it. So So I wouldn't recommend that approach, but that was how I did it.
So if you're going to write again, would you do it very differently?
Well, I say I would try and write it differently, but I think instinctively, you kind of write the way that works for you. And I was asking other people who've written, and it seems like everyone has their own style. So I will try and do it more efficiently, but if that doesn't work, I may revert to the old way.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Some people do a lot of plotting and planning before they start, and others don't. Others literally write and see what happens. So you just have to find a way that works for you.
Yes, I think I read that Lee Child actually does exactly that. He basically just starts with no idea of what his story is.
Well, if it works for him.
Yeah, indeed.
So tell us about your main character, Josh.
Right. So the main character is a guy, he's in his 20s. His main job is a personal trainer, and he works in a London gym. And I qualified as a personal trainer, although not sort of as a real job, just because I like physical exercise and I wanted to figure out how I could improve my own training. But it is a sort of world I know, and so it was an easy job to give that character. So the book basically begins with him training one of his clients in the gym, and a dead body is found in the gym, and the gym is closed, and he has to go home. Now, this main character, Josh, has a second part-time job as a private investigator. Now, that would seem pretty unlikely, and as to how he's ended up with these two very different jobs is explained in the book. Anyway, he goes home and he's going through his emails, and he gets an email out of the blue from a client he was previously helping a year ago, whose daughter had gone missing 25 years earlier, and who he had sort of helped to resolve the story, but it was still slightly open. And he gets this email out of the blue from her saying, please meet me urgently. And then what I've tried to do is tell two stories in one. So the book alternates between going back to his original investigation and tracking that to find this missing student, which involves England and Spain, and his job as a personal trainer. And as the story progresses, the two unconnected stories start to become connected.
Ah, great. And whereabouts in Spain does the story go?
Well, I have to be a bit careful because Spain is quite relevant to this story, and I can't really reveal too much or it becomes a bit of a plot spoiler. But essentially, it's all based in Tenerife. Okay, interesting. And have you been to Tenerife a lot? Do you know it well? Yes, I do know it well. I know it probably better than any other part of Spain. So again, it made it a bit easier to write. So essentially, the book has three main locations. One is London, where I was living. The other is Bournemouth, which is where I'm originally from. And the third is Tenerife, which I visited. So I felt I could write more convincingly about those three.
Yeah. And so Josh is also, you mentioned another job. He's also a part-time private investigator by night. Did you have to do a bit of research into what that means to be a private investigator?
Yes. And I didn't really want him to be a sort of, old-fashioned, middle-aged person who knocks on doors. I thought that probably wasn't very realistic for someone of his age. So I gave him a background as someone who'd studied computer science at university, who was very good at technology. And essentially, his private investigation work was primarily tracking down people who defrauded clients through internet scams, because I thought that was something he could credibly do. He's a sort of hacker, but someone who does it morally, if that's possible. And I've tried to explain why he does it and the limitations within which he does it as a story. And yes, it involved a lot of research because I'm not very good at hacking at all.
And so have you already started writing a second book, or are you having a bit of a break?
Well, I actually wrote this book quite a long time ago. The whole process took me about a year from first page to last. As I say, I wrote it very inefficiently because I was rewriting as I was going along. And then the process of getting it published took a long time. So I've now had plenty of time to start thinking about another one. But I wasn't sure if this one would gain any traction. So I was a bit reluctant to commit to a sequel until I knew that this one was popular. If it is, I definitely write a sequel because the story sort of lends itself to lots of new stories. But for the moment, I'm writing a completely different novel, which is all about revenge.
Okay. So with different characters.
Totally different, yes.
Yeah. So you need to get this one out there and see if it's going to take off before writing a sequel.
Yes, it's difficult because inevitably there are lots of new books coming out. I mean, more than people can possibly manage to read or even be aware of. And every time you go into a bookshop, you're just sort of confronted by literally thousands of books, and many of them quite new. And I fully understand why people just read books written by people they've read before, because it's just safe. It's quite hard to pick up a new author and read them. And it's also quite difficult to get people to review your book if you haven't already written one unless you're famous. So I'm finding that initial traction quite tricky, but I'm hoping, yes, it will go somewhere.
Yes, well, good luck. In the meantime, if listeners want to get a copy of A Death in the Gym, it's out now. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Patrick Hardy that we've been chatting with. Thank you for joining us, Patrick.
Well, thank you again, Hannah. Great to talk to you.
Talk Radio Europe.
Your voice in Spain.
Joining us on the line now is Rebecca Pells. Following careers in banking and the charitable sector, she embraced her creative passions, becoming a full-time artist with her work collected across the globe. Her focus has now turned to painting with words. Her debut historical novel, Absent Lives, marks the beginning of this new journey, an exploration of memory, loss, and the quiet power of untold stories. It was actually inspired by true Lusitania family history. Welcome to the book show, Rebecca.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Great to have you with us. And congratulations, your debut novel. Very exciting.
Yes, I know, especially as I never set out to write a book. But it's been quite a long journey, one that started, over 10 years ago with a conversation with my 92-year-old father. We were going through some old family photographs and came across an intriguing little album which had got this, it's only small and a brown suede cover that was falling to pieces. And inside these old photographs, some you couldn't recognise, they were so degraded. But others showed this young couple who were clearly in love and having a wonderful time with tennis parties and picnics and all sorts. On the cover, on the suede cover, was an embossed picture of a First Nations chief in full headdress and the initials EP. And my father said to me, now that was my uncle Elmore. He and his wife were aboard the Lusitania when it was sunk in the First World War. And he said they lost their baby son, John, and that's who I'm named after. That's all he could tell me. And sadly, he died some 6 months later. I then started to do some research just out of curiosity for family history reasons, really, and ended up embarking on about a 3-year journey of research where I went down all kinds of rabbit holes on the internet and on Ancestry.com, places like that. And it revealed such an interesting story, not only on a personal level, but the Lusitania was a very famous ship in its time. It was one of Cunard's premier passenger ships. The Lusitania and its sister ship, the Mauretania, used to vie with each other for an award called the Blue Riband, which was for the fastest crossing a passage across the Atlantic Ocean. So it was a very well-known ship. And it sunk on the 7th of May, 1915, so within the First World War. Unlike the Titanic disaster, which was just 3 years earlier, this was no accident. It was targeted by a German U-boat, which were known to be lurking in the Irish Sea. And it fired a torpedo into the steel hull, and it sunk this great passenger ship in just 18 minutes. It was an event that shocked the world because it was a passenger ship, and so it went against the rules of engagement, if you like, and it caused a huge outcry, and it's widely believed these days that it was the catalyst that actually brought the Americans into the First World War, because the majority of passengers were Americans. So you could extrapolate from that it actually changed the course of history, because if the Americans hadn't come into the First World War, then we don't know what the outcome might have been. However, for the passengers on board the ship, it was far more personal. Of the 1,959 passengers, and probably some stowaways too, only 767 survived. But among them were Anita and Elmore. They were aboard the ship because, although they were British citizens, they had emigrated to Canada a few years earlier, but decided to return to the UK so that Elmore could join his regiment to go off and fight in the war. And they had travelled across America with their 10-week-old son, John, which is a feat in itself, I think, to travel with a baby that young.
Yes.
And for all intents and purposes, the journey on the Lusitania seems to have gone very well until the day before they were due to arrive in Liverpool. So on the morning of the 7th, it was a foggy morning. There was no sign of a naval escort, which had been promised. It was given to any passenger ship because it was well known that there were German U-boats in the area. The passengers had all sat down to lunch, and at 2:10, the torpedo struck. Anita and Elmore rushed to get baby John and their life jackets, only to discover that there were no life jackets for babies. They realised that they were going to have to jump overboard because very quickly the ship listed to the port side, I think it was. So it meant that the lifeboats were either hanging too far out for people to get on, or they were leaning into the ship, which meant when they tried to lower them, they hit the side of the hull with horrible consequences. And in fact, of the 22 lifeboats, only 6 were successfully launched. And Anita and Elmore made the decision that they needed to jump into the water. And so Elmore held baby John across his chest. They jumped and they went down and they surfaced, and baby John was still there, safe with him. And they went to try and swim away from the ship because they realised when it actually went under, it was going to create this great vortex of water and pull them down with it. But they didn't have time, and indeed that's what happened, and they got pulled down again. And when Elmore surfaced, by now his arms were numb, he couldn't feel anything, and baby John was gone.
Oh, my goodness, how awful.
Yeah. They were in the water for a couple of hours before they were able to get onto a collapsible lifeboat and subsequently transferred to a fishing boat, which took them to Queenstown, which today is known as Cobb in County Cork in Ireland. And there they spent several awful weeks. Well, Elmore was injured and he ended up needing to go to hospital. He caught pneumonia. And they searched the temporary morgues, which had been set up by the Cunard Line. And eventually they had to leave with not knowing what had happened to John, and came back to London and for a period of recovery. It was another 3 years before Elmore was well enough to join his regiment. So it wasn't until May 1918 that he went off to France. And Anita received a telegram to say he had arrived safely. The next thing she heard was another telegram to say that he had just 6 weeks later, that he had gone missing in action in the Battle of the Bois de Bout in northern France. So here she is, poor lady, with no baby, no husband, not really knowing whether they're dead or alive. What does she do next? And it was this aspect of the story that really intrigued me, because I was able to do further research. And the book is very much character-led, particularly about Anita, because what interested me was how someone survives those kind of awful events in their life. I suppose today we would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. Yeah. But then it was during a war and everybody was going through awful times. But it was that aspect of the story that when I decided to write a book, I thought I was going to approach it from. There are other excellent Lusitania novels which tend to be plot-driven, particularly because there was some controversy around why the Lusitania wasn't given a naval escort. Winston Churchill was actually the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, and it would have been on his orders that it was given a naval escort. And in fact, there was a ship waiting off the coast of Ireland to do just that. But the order was never forthcoming. And from my research, I believe that the government papers from the time show that no order was given. And there is this theory that Churchill thought that if the Germans attacked the Lusitania, it would bring the Americans into the war. So there's this suggestion that it was deliberate on his part.
Wow.
Which is quite shocking in itself.
Yeah, isn't it?
But yes, all sorts of intriguing stories around the Lusitania. But I very much set out to tell the personal story, which I hope is what I've managed to achieve.
Yes, amazing. What a story. So were you able to find out all of this through the research that you were doing?
Well, I ended up with a huge amount of research, factual, so much that when several friends who I was boring with this story of my research said to me, well, you should write a book. And I thought, oh, well, it's family history. Nobody's going to be interested. But then I thought, well, actually, yeah, because even today, I was watching the news the other day with the awful news from Iran. And of course, recently we've had, ongoing in Ukraine and Gaza, etc. And I thought, well, what relevance is this story to today? But it's no different. It's ordinary people who get caught up in wars, in awful situations. Yeah. And it's the ongoing impact in their lives that interests me. So, yes, I ended up with a huge amount of research. So what I did, I got a long length of paper. It was an old piece of unused wallpaper on the back of it. And I wrote out this long timeline of all the dates and the various journeys and births, deaths, marriages, all that sort of thing. So I could see the timeline of how everything had happened. And in actual fact, it proved very useful because it gave me a framework around which to weave the fictional story, because ultimately Absent Lives is an historical novel. It's a fictional book, but it does involve real people, real events, but there's a fictional element to it as well. So, that's how I approached the writing.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. And having never done anything like that before, was it a real challenge or something you really enjoyed, or a bit of both?
I really loved the research because you go down these rabbit holes and for ages you don't find a new piece of information. Then suddenly out of the blue you find a missing piece of the jigsaw and it's like, yay! The writing, once I got going, that was okay. It was quite difficult initially, having never written a novel, to know quite how to structure it. And I went back and edited it quite a few times. And in the end, I went back to an old trick that I used to do with my essays at school, because I never knew how to open essays. And so I used to start them in the middle and then put the beginning in it sort of later on. And that, in fact, that's how I wrote the book as well. But I ended up with the initial copy of it being my version of it, having too many facts in. I'd researched these facts. I was determined to get them all in initially, but I ended up taking quite a lot of them out because obviously you've got to have a flow to a story as well. So in the end, the writing of the book actually has proved to be almost the easier part, in the sense that since I actually finished writing the book, it's been about 3 years, and it's taken me that long to find a publisher. So that's been quite challenging, but I'm happy to say that my persistence paid off.
Yeah, fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes.
So you've obviously learned...
So I was going to say, people say, oh, it must be really exciting. And I said, well, it is, but it's also a huge relief
yes.
to finally get it to this point. Yeah.
And you've obviously learned an awful lot writing this. Has it made you want to write more?
It has, yes. I have got another story in line, which I need to start the research on very soon. So, yes, I do plan to write more, definitely.
Great.
And it will be another historical novel, but this time it will be set in my hometown of Shrewsbury, and it will be, I'm an artist, and it will be have an art factor to it, if I can put it like that.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
well, in the meantime, if listeners want to get a copy of Absent Lives, it's out now. It's available on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Rebecca Pells, who we've been chatting with today. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. Thank you.
Joining us on the line now is Linda Hartley. She studied dance and creative writing at Dartington College of Arts, then went to train as a somatic movement therapist and psychotherapist. Writing has always been woven through her practice. She's with us on the book show to talk about her latest novel, Angel Wing, which follows on from Broken Line. Together, the novels tell the story of 3 generations of women in one family, covering the themes of love, loss, guilt, trauma, and betrayal. It's a beautifully written evacuee tale about a vulnerable girl without parents, guidance, or safety in a world torn apart by war. We follow her poignant journey into growing resilience and womanhood. Welcome to the book show, Linda.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's great to have you with us. So this is very much a follow-on from Broken Line, is it?
It is, yes. When I finished The Broken Line, I realised that the absence of Ellen, my main character's mother in The Broken Line, it was such a strong presence, if that makes sense. It was such a strong presence that I just immediately felt I needed to write her story as well. So that's how it began.
Yeah, so this story actually goes back before Broken Line, does it?
It does. Well, The Broken Line is essentially the third in this lineage, Anita, and she goes on a quest to find her grandmother. So Ellen, the main character of Angel Wing, is the one in between, the mother of Anita, the daughter of Liza. So it does go back in time, and also forward in time, if that makes sense. It's a kind of a circular structure. So I do feel that they can be read on alone, each stands alone, but they can also be read in a kind of circular structure in either order.
So without giving too much away, can you tell us a bit about what happened in The Broken Line to set the scene?
Okay. Well, it begins with Anita, and she goes through a lot of loss, traumatic loss in her early life and her teenage years. She's very much at a loss in her life. And after her father dies, she finds a letter in his papers that suggests that this grandmother she's never known and the mother she's never known, the grandmother might still be alive. So it sets her off on a quest to find this grandmother. And the only clue she really has is that she might have been in Belfast. So it sets Anita off on a quest to discover her grandmother in Belfast. So she's grown up without knowing her mother or her grandmother. So this broken maternal line is what's at the heart of both of the novels.
And when was The Broken Line set?
It begins in 1970-ish, and then it jumps into the 1980s, and then it goes back eventually to the late 1920s, 1930s, as we explore her grandmother's story in Ireland.
Okay.
So it encompasses some themes around the Irish conflict, Protestant Catholic, the Troubles, and what was happening in the 1980s in London, as well as what was happening in Ireland in the 1920s. So it's a little, in both the novels, there's a kind of a backdrop of wartime stories that are both separating and linking the characters.
Yeah. And where did you get the idea from? Why did you want to tell a story about 3 generations of women?
It partly comes out of my own family. It's in no way telling my own family history, but my mother knew nothing at all about her grandmother, and except that perhaps she came from Belfast. So that was a little seed of that idea about setting part of the story in Belfast. And I wasn't trying to recall or discover my own family story, but I was always intrigued by this mystery of why might someone know nothing about her ancestry, a complete blank, and she wasn't even interested, my mother, bless her. Mm-hmm. And it made me wonder what sort of things might happen that would lead such a rift in a family, such a break in a family lineage.
Yeah. So let's talk about the new book then, Angel Wing. Tell us about the characters and the scenes for this one.
Yes, well, Ellen, the middle generation, the story starts 1955, and Ellen is driving on her way to Belfast. She has recently discovered that the mother she thought was dead, might still be alive. So she sets off to see if she can find her missing mother. And she has an accident. And so there's a framework sequence that we keep dipping into throughout the novel of Ellen as she has the accident and after the accident, what happens to her. So there's a kind of a thread of Ellen's life hanging in the balance, really. And she starts to have flashbacks of her childhood, which was a very cold and loveless home. The person who's taking the place of her mother, we find out was her adoptive mother. She's totally unable to love Ellen. So Ellen grows up very vulnerable and actually quite traumatized, what we call developmental trauma. She really is a vulnerable child. So then the middle storyline takes place begins at the start of World War II, when Ellen is evacuated and she's sent to a village in Northumberland and billeted there. And so this is the main story, what happens to Ellen during the war years and how she copes with being a very vulnerable, quite traumatized child in a situation where she's lost everything familiar. She does have lovely family that she stays with, but she is without her own family, without her own home. And she makes 2 friends. One is a village girl who's suffered abuse from her father. So she also, in a very different way, is an unparented child and quite unstable, we could imagine. And then a young boy comes from Berlin, young Jewish boy, comes from Berlin, whose parents had been killed by the Nazis. So he's obviously very traumatized in a different way. So it's a story of these 3 traumatized young people and how they deal with being in this world. It's on one hand torn apart by this rather lovely rural location up in the Northumbrian hills. And Ellen discovers a German pilot who has crashed and parachuted down into the woods. And the three of them together, they take it on themselves to look after this German pilot. And there's a lot of, power dynamics being upended. He's totally at their mercy. And all three of them have different reasons for wanting him to be there with them. So they keep this secret. And so there's a lot of intrigue around the power dynamics and the emotional needs that he is, or that he's meeting, that each of them are trying to have met through this young man, also young and away from home. So it's the complex of relationships and how they navigate all of that. So that's kind of the first half of the novel. I don't want to give too much away.
No, fair enough.
But Ellen's profound attachment to the young pilot leads her into danger. She's convinced she's fallen in love with him, and she needs to stay with him wherever he goes. So it does lead her into danger eventually.
Yeah. And do you have to do a lot of research for your books? Because you're covering lots of different time periods in history. Do you need to sort of remind yourself or look back into what life was like in these different periods in history?
Well, I did, yes. For Angel Wing, I did quite a bit of reading on World War II. And, I was born in the 50s, so I grew up in a world that was still recovering from the war. So there was a little bit of a sense of familiarity with that grey world and, the way people dressed and had dressed. But I did quite a bit of reading, and especially around wartime childhood, how it was for the children. In The Broken Line, I did quite a lot of research in Belfast. I visited Belfast and walked around, visited the library, read books, I did a lot of looking around, visited locations and places, institutions that I thought might be part of the novel. So, yeah, I loved that part, actually. It was quite exciting and discovering new things.
And do you think the story's complete now, or could there be a book 3?
I had a small idea of book 3, but it's not really grabbing my attention the way the first 2 did. So probably not. But if I did, it would be from quite a different perspective. I feel this cycle of the 3 unmothered daughters feels complete enough. So there is a little bit of an idea, but it's not quite holding my attention enough at the moment yet.
No, fair enough. So have you got another completely different idea for a future book?
I've got a couple of ideas for non-fiction books that I'm playing around with. I have also written 4 and edited 2 non-fiction books. So there's a lot of ideas floating around. I'm not quite sure which one's going to land.
Yeah.
I think possibly one of the non-fiction books is taking my attention most.
Nice to have lots of options, though.
Yes, and it's interesting being in this sort of in-between place, and it does feel complete, this cycle with the story of these 3 women. But Anita's story could still go on. I do see that there's a little thread that could go on in some way.
Yeah. Well, watch this space. In the meantime, listeners can get a copy of Angel Wing. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Linda Hartley, who we've been chatting with. Linda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Hannah.
You're listening to Hannah Murray on The Book Show.
Joining us on the line now is Alana Sabawal. She's a Goldsmiths graduate with a master's degree in screenwriting. With a global background spanning Italy, India and South Africa, Alana brings a unique perspective to her writing. She's with us on The Book Show to talk about her latest novel of Rice, Love and War. It's set amidst the turmoil of the Vietnam War, where the line between loyalty and betrayal is blurred. Welcome to The Book Show, Alana.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you with us. So tell us about the inspiration behind this book. I know you travelled to Vietnam, didn't you?
I did in 2011, but this weird fascination really started when I was 10 years old at school. And I loved the library. Obviously, I loved books. And I discovered the Life Annual, the old American Life magazines. They used to release an annual, with all the photos, of that particular year. And obviously the year was kind of early 1970s. And it was filled with all those iconic Vietnam photos that we've all probably seen through the years. And I don't know, there was just something that was fascinating and horrifying about the war. And, when I sort of tried to find out about it, but it wasn't really something that was in conversation in South Africa at the time. This is obviously where I grew up. And I think that fascination stayed. And then when I finished my first book, I was actually in the final bits of it, was in the final edit when I was in Vietnam. And because of this fascination. And I never really thought I was going to write anything, but it was literally the story just found me. I was on a flight from Saigon to Da Nang and my character just popped in and said hi. And there you go.
Amazing. So tell us about your main character.
Amélie is, she's in French Indochine. She has a French mother and English father, and she's obviously very happy, lives an idyllic life, even though this sort of, war is happening at the time of the Vietnam independence. It's the French, which, of course, the French lose. And then through a series of horrible events, she ends up in Hanoi when her mother becomes the mistress of a high-flying communist official. She's somewhat idealistic and rather traumatized from the sort of sudden changes from this perfect childhood. And then she's easily, I wouldn't call it quite groomed, but kind of taught and to become an asset for the communist government. And then with her cover as a French journalist, and she's a very keen photographer, she's then sent to Saigon when she's in her early 20s. She sort of feels has a little bit of an imposter syndrome as a spy, thinking she's no good at it. She has fairly strong beliefs in communism, but at the same time, this is all kind of challenged when she's in Saigon, and where she is meant to befriend American officers, obviously to gain intelligence, as per her handler's requests. She does the opposite. She falls in love with a journalist, and then she does eventually start a relationship with an American officer. And her emotions are pretty much in turmoil. This is the whole sort of loyalty and betrayal bit comes in. But, I hope my characters love her as much as I do. She is ever so slightly ditzy, but she's warm and very, very, very brave.
Yeah. And you obviously did a massive amount of research for the book. Was it important that it was all very realistic, of a spy, I guess, at that time, and how it was likely to work?
Exactly. The research was... Gosh, it was enormous. Luckily, I love history, and it was fascinating. It was a lot more political, this war, than I had ever thought it would be. And so what I wanted to do, because obviously it's the background of the war, I wanted to make sure that my facts played out. Even though the story is fictitious, I really like the fact that it was, within real life scenarios. So that all is perfectly researched. And then her being a spy, I kind of sort of had to make things up. If I was a spy, what would I do in this situation? And obviously I'm an avid reader of spy novels and spy movies, and yeah, so I guess the rest I kind of made up. But essentially the facts of the war and the situation. And a lot of people are based on true characters. I changed some's names, some I didn't. For example, her handler, Pham One An, he was really quite famous and quite decorated after the war. He was the Communist North's absolute favorite spy. He was her handler, and in my novel, but in real life, he pretty much was the person that I describe. I did read a couple of books. I don't know how much time I have. I've got an interesting story about him.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Anyway, so when I was looking for the character for the male protagonist's name, my daughter said I was looking for kind of an East Coast preppy name, 1960s, and I kind of was sort of sold on the name Tom. So my daughters, who were keen Gossip Girl watchers, told me, "Oh no, he should be Tom Bass." Fine. So I said, okay, Tom Bass it is. We like how it sounds. Did a quick little Google search, who's Tom Bass? Nothing popped up. Then later, when I started writing about him, I started him off as Thomas Bass. And then I did another Google, and Thomas Bass ends up being the historian and author of this book called The Spy Who Loved Us, which was a true story about Pham One An, which was completely bizarre. And I kind of took as a sort of sign that this book has to be written.
Isn't that amazing? How weird is that?
I know, and I didn't change his name. I was told that maybe I need to contact this actual Thomas Bass that wrote the book and explain how this happened, but I haven't done it yet, but maybe down the line I will.
So does it feel weird now that the book is out there, having spent such a long time on it?
It does. In some way, it's a huge relief, because it really did take me like almost 12 years. Obviously, a lot was happening at the time, but it's wonderful to see it out there. And I've already had some great reviews, and I hope, and I think my old readers of my first book, I've kind of kept it in the same sort of thriller, but quite easy reading. Because I've got mainly a women's readership, I try to not be too heavy on all the politics. I didn't want to sort of lose them there. So, but I do. So I hope I've done okay. So far, my readers said it's great. They understand the Vietnam War like they never have before. And they obviously enjoyed the whole romance and the thrills and
nice. So you say it's a similar kind of genre to your first book?
Exactly, yeah, kind of, sort of reluctant female spy who gets drawn into all this web of deceit and betrayal and, action adventure, actually.
Yeah. And did you plot how the story was going to pan out before you started writing it?
More or less. I had a very, very faint outline, but I don't enjoy writing if I know exactly what's going to happen. For me, the joy is to actually to discover the story as I go along. The book was probably about 450 pages, and then my editor obviously cut it down. It was just too big. So there was so much going on. But, and a few storylines changed. The ending changed. My eldest daughter, who's my truest, most harshest critic, like my first ending. So I had to do a little maneuver, which she approves of. So, that's the way I write. Apparently it's called panting. That's something I have learned recently.
Yeah. And with regards to the editing, when you hand your work over and it gets edited or ripped apart, is that difficult? Do you have to just go with it, or do you sometimes disagree?
No, generally, I think you have to trust your editor, and I use the same editor, Claire Strombeck, who did my first novel. So I trust her. And also, I think it's because I was a designer in my past life. I'm used to being critiqued, and I'm very open to it. So, obviously the book's my baby, but it's okay. I know when the baby's been naughty and I need to...
Yeah, great. So have you got ideas for the next book?
Oh, I do. Unfortunately, I'm ready. So at the moment, I'm in the research stage. This time, I am looking at Second World War from a slightly different perspective. It's actually from the perspective of a spy in India during the war, because I think a lot of books, obviously, in France, generally in France, in Germany, in England, but I thought maybe something set in India. My background to this story, I don't know. Do you want to know?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Anyway, so I went a couple of years ago to the History Festival in the Chalk Valley, and I went to a talk by, and I forgot the actress's name, a very famous English actress, I'm told, and her husband. Anyway, she's a daughter of Peter Fleming and Celia Johnson, the famous actress. And Peter Fleming was Ian Fleming's brother. And this talk was generally, her and her husband were reading letters from Peter Fleming and his wife during the war when he was stationed in Delhi he was stationed there, in the war effort. I didn't quite know what his position was there. Anyway, it was just lovely. I just really enjoyed the interaction. Anyway, so that's then when the idea came that I wonder what it would be like, a war story set there. And then I did some Googling and I looked for Indian spies, famous Indian spies. And I came across this Indian spy. He was actually like a quintuplet spy. He spied for everyone, for the Germans, the Americans, the Japanese, you name it. The English, obviously. But his handler was actually Peter Fleming in Delhi.
Oh.
So I thought, okay, so I think I'm onto something here. So we are still doing a lot of research, but I'm hoping this would be something interesting. My character has found me. She's a lovely girl, leggy blonde from Hampshire. And let's see where her journey goes.
Yeah, exciting. Well, in the meantime, listeners can get a copy of Rice, Love and War. It's out now. It's available on our website, TRE.radio. It's by Ilana Sabawal, who we've been chatting with today. Ilana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to a TRE production. If you've enjoyed this program, there'll be another episode waiting for you next week, right here on this platform, where you can also access our extensive back catalogue of shows and interviews. For more information on our live programming, social media channels and apps, and how to contact Talk Radio Europe, please visit TRE.radio.